2021 Kenneth Burke Memorial Lecture. This annual event honors the legacy of the American literary theorist, poet, essayist, and novelist for which it is named. Burke taught at Penn State at University Park campus, and his papers are archived in the Penn State libraries. Relevant to today's talk, Burke developed a sustained discussion of race and racial injustice in his book, a book that we are very familiar with, that is A Rhetoric of Motives. A central theme running through the rhetoric involves the mystery produced in the separation of different social classes, as well as the courtship devices designed to transcend such estrangement. It is frequently within such a context that Burke discusses race, especially focusing on one such aspect of race, white Southerners' doctrine of racial superiority in relation to African Americans. Burke's references to race relations, peppered through the text, work to define a central element of Burke's concept of race, that is, positioning race as a socially defined group identity, which can be rhetorically manipulated for a multitude of purposes. It is important to note that Burke developed his thought on race and the rhetoric through a sustained conversation with African-American novelist and critic Ralph Ellison. For example, he commented on Ellison's essay, Richard Wright's Blues in 1945, and then received an elaborate response from Ellison. In his Rhetoric published in 1950, he discussed the conflict faced by artists such as Richard Wright, the conflicts between individual and the racial identity. Obviously, this discussion resulted from his exchange with Ellison. So thank you for coming today so that we can continue to learn about racial relations and the rhetoric. I'm very proud to introduce this year's Burke lecturer, Dr. Ersula J. Dr. J is an associate professor of African and African American studies at Arizona State University. She's a critical race rhetorician whose research and teaching interests include rhetorics of race and culture, critical race and gender studies, rhetoric theory, and Black women's intellectual history. Her book, The Lynching, Violence, Rhetoric, and American Identity, out of the University Press of Mississippi in 2019, which examines lynching as a rhetorical strategy and the material practice interwoven with the formation of American national identity, received the 2020 Book Award from the Rhetoric Society of America. Of course, Dr. Orr is a Penn Stater, one of us. Welcome home, Ursula. By the way, tomorrow will be Dr. Orr's birthday, so happy birthday. So today her talk title is Civility, Rhetoric, Impatience, and the Reclamation of Time, the case of Sandra Bland. After Dr. Orr's talk, we will present the winners for this year's Burke Prize in Rhetoric Graduate Student Essay Competition and the Rhetoric of the Civil Rights Movement Undergraduate Essay Contest. The presentation will start around 1 p.m. and last for about 10 minutes. So I hope you will be able to stay for the presentation of the prizes. All right, so now without further ado, Dr. Orr, please.
Hello. Oh, that works. That works. Okay. Oh. sorry, I had to get to the share screen part. Hello, good morning. Well, no, it's afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all are well. Thank you so very much for welcoming back to Penn State. We are Penn State. And yes, Shelye, you're completely right. I am a Penn Stater. Graduated in 2011 and I'm back. Like, that's kind of crazy. Even if virtually, like, that's super cool and it's an incredible honor. Thank you so much for that gracious introduction. And again, I am incredibly excited and honored to deliver the 2021 Burke Lecture. Today's talk, Civility, Rhetorical Impatience, and the Reclamation of Time, the case of Sandra Bland. Rhetorical is, there's actually a typo, and I apologize for the title that's up right here because I've been consistently playing with titles as a way to focus on which parts when I deliver lectures. And today's lecture is very much about rhetorical impatience and the reclamation of time, but I'm working to try to pull out the way that oppositional, Hooks's notion of the oppositional gaze manifests as a countertemporal posture via Bland's performance during the dialogic of the stop. So I apologize for the conflict between the title that we currently have up here and the title of today's talk, which is Civility, quote, Rhetorical Impatience and the Reclamation of Time, the case of Sandra Bland. Today, I'm going to share a few thoughts on civility, temporality, and gendered anti-Blackness. This lecture is part of a larger project titled Civility While Black and Female, hence the reason why in the left-hand corner we have Civility While Black and Female. This larger project examines the regimes of power that inform how discourses of civility stigmatize, criminalize, dissect, diagnose, and pathologize Black women's self-possession. Scholars have investigated civility as a democratic good, as a mode of discipline, and as a mode of containment. Less consideration, however, has been given to the chronopolitics of civility, that is, to the way civility discourse conveys a sense of time and timing. What I share today investigates how appeals to civility when leveled against Black women signal nostalgia for a stereotyped Black past in which the premier model of respectable Black womanhood is mammy. Taking the July 10th, 2015 stop of Sandra Bland as its point of departure and thinking specifically about how misogynoir arrests takes up and depletes the lived time of Black women. This lecture places scholarship on civility in conversation with scholarship on temporality and gendered anti-Black policing to consider the ways civility manifests temporally as capture in the lives of Black women. As I said, this is a work in progress and it will progress in about 3 parts. I'll begin by offering a brief review of scholarship on civility. And again, this is brief. And then I'll offer a heuristic, or what I'm working to develop as a heuristic for reading civility as a mutilating form of racial temporality, before applying this heuristic to the dialogic of Bland's 2010-2015 stop. I'll conclude by offering a few thoughts on Bland's countertemporal orientation and the weight of her response of, I'm waiting on you. So again, thank you, and part 1. I have to apologize, I'm very disappointed. The slide was much better. It didn't look like this at all. But I'm just gonna move forward. But there's smoke in the background. I'm calling for something here. That's a whole nother level, but I apologize. Part 1, civility. If politics denotes the means by which social actors navigate the challenges of civic community, then civility denotes a means by which such navigation is presumed achievable. Political philosophers think of civility as it relates to citizens' ability to negotiate political community, and as such frame civility as a civic virtue on account of its assumed transcendental quality. America's liberal democratic tradition posits civility as a virtue of worth on account that treating people as equally dignified subjects during times of disagreement and difference encourages the kind of social engagement and robust deliberation requisite for a viable democratic community. Within this tradition of manners, civility denotes politeness, courteousness, and considerateness, and is valued most amid instances of difference and disagreement because it is assumed to express that despite difference and differences, diverse perspectives, the voices of others, are valued. In this way, civility is conceived as a common good, as a practice of egalitarianism. As cultural critics, historians, and communication scholars have detailed, civility isn't always about exercising mutual respect, as is also about managing dissent in the ways that accommodate the dominant social order. Historically deployed as a means of social control and containment, civilizing strategies in the form of, quote, legal, political, and physical restrictions, end quote, discursive and physical violence, and modes of looking have, and modes of looking have and continue to serve as powerful practices of race and gender discipline. Critical scholarship on civility demonstrates how civility evades calls for change and justice by masquerading as morality, by masquerading as care and compassion, and by labeling disagreeable forms of communication as overreach and inappropriate and violent. Labeling disagreeable speech uncivil frames said speech and the bodies from which said speech emanates as threats to be contained. Such tactics, which serve to silence and punish marginalized groups, mark civility as a generative site for the production of the new racism. Distinguished from the explicit and overt racism of the past, the new racism operates as a, quote, raceless articulation of a racist expression that masks the conniving egoism and violence of men and women with the reputation for refined manners. Defining civility, and when I think about this application of civility, right, as a racialized practice or a raceless expression using Goldberg's terms, I'm thinking about some of the phrases that were used during the dialogic of the stop with regard to Nsenya when Nsenya says, "Are you okay?" Right? There's a racial grammar there. Would you mind putting your cigarette out? Are you finished? These are moments and ways that I'm trying to identify as these are on their face value, they seem to be civil interactions, right? Kind of invitational opportunities to, in a way, right, recollect or recalibrate oneself. But there's a disciplinary power laden with that. And so, yeah, I'm just working to kind of pull that out via the dialogic of the stop with these notions of what is appropriate behavior and what is inappropriate, what is civil and what is uncivil. This born again civility, Goldberg contends defining civility as strategically inscribed and embedded violence. David Goldberg contends that because the modern expression of civility is driven by anti-Blackness, that 21st century appeals to civility reflect the logics of a born-again racism. This notion of civility as born again signals a temporal orientation akin to a racially ordered past. Time is not infinite. However, those who, to quote Cooper, own time, that is, those who have the power to determine when time begins and ends, the power to determine the pace of the day, this is Mills among other people as well, and the power to maintain possession of time, have gained ownership of time through violent acts of transference in which time is differentially allocated in ways that reinscribe racial and social hierarchies. In Too Late, Racialized Time and the Closure of the Past, Asaji analyzes Fanon's account of the white gaze to extrapolate a theory of racialized time as closure. Specifically, Asaji reads Fanon's encounter as the moment of temporal dislocation, as an instance in which Fanon's racialized body is displaced from history and relegated to a closed past. As she explains, the instance in which Fanon sees how he is seen is the instance in which he is figured as a perpetual inhabitant of a time outside of progress. Racism immobilizes and eclipses Fanon's capacity for a future beyond a, quote, stereotyped Black past, end quote. He is therefore always behind, always late, forever stuck, and always looking back on account of the kind of paranoia racial temporalization engenders. The past, Asaji concludes, cuts Blacks off from a, quote, open future, end quote, on account of rendering them stuck in the past. Engaging Asaji, Helen Ong carefully reminds that the past, quote, is never fully closed over or sealed off, but rather sustained through retention and lingering or the lingering or residue of the past and the present and future, and protension, which names the futorial anticipation of what is not yet fulfilled or what might never come to be fulfilled. Consequently, the past is never really the past or closed, but rather continuously reproduced through past, present, future instances of anti-Black violence. Such continuity is the way whiteness functions as time sucks that strip, that take up, that wastes time in ways that exhausts and depletes the life force and lived time of racialized others. Continental philosopher Charles Mills describes this phenomenon of time and life force depletion as the, quote, temporal deprivation of time, unquote, to signal the particularly extractive and transactional nature of what he calls white time. As a, quote, regime of temporal exploitation and accumulation, end quote, white time sustains the status quo of racial hierarchy by transferring time from one set of lives to another. Because white time is a racial regime of exploitation that turns on access and notions of ownership, acts of temporal deprivation, which by nature diminish the life expectancy of racialized others, make questions about time indistinguishable from questions about race and injustice. Not completely unlike Fanon's experience with the closed past, Hortense's experience of time as capture exhibits anti-Blackness as an arresting seizure of bodily will that names her through, quote, metaphors of captivity and mutilation, so that it is if neither time nor history, nor historiography, or its topics show movement, end quote. Capture, explains Spillers, is a time of torturous immobility, as, quote, the human subject is murdered over and over again by passions of a bloodless and anonymous anachronism, showing itself in endless disguise, end quote. For Spillers, anti-Blackness is a mutilating temporality that renders her, quote, a marked woman. As a marked woman, she is subjected to the intergenerational death sentence that is anti-Blackness, to an incessant and continuous murdering of the self that, like Fanon, eclipses her capacity to move beyond a stereotyped Black past. Consequently, she is rendered stuck, immobile. Following Spillers, there is no forward movement for those marked by the history of anti-Blackness, inaugurated under chattel slavery. No progression towards liberation, only the facade of freedom and the promise of captivity. This experience of capture, as Simone Brown explains, is the negative inherence of the slave's progeny. The result of the unfinished emancipations manifest this past as a past that contemporary Blacks relive as their present. As these scholars illustrate, anti-Blackness produces a temporal orientation achieved through a forgetting and denial that not only, quote, masks the operations of racism, but also reifies the human as an exclusionary category that demands an outside and which requires the death of Black people. So the point to recognize here is that white temporal rhetorics close off time, attend discourses of erasure and atonement to alleviate white guilt, and assume the pictorial orientation of whiteness through narratives of progress constituted by Black death. In these ways, white temporal rhetorics forestall Black, Indigenous, and non-Black futures. Part 2, Black women and the temporal orientation of civility. Scholarship tracing the long history of Black women in the carceral state links the removal of Black domestic labor from white homes as the root for criminalizing the ways Black women show up in public. Black feminist scholars, including Collins, Higginbotham, and Cooper, have demonstrated how charges of incivility are commonly leveled at Black women whose public performances challenge the normalized script of respectability and acquiescence to white dominance. As a performance of moral worthiness that aligned with dominant values of the good and virtuous woman, respectability was employed by Black women in defense against negative stereotypes of us as lazy, hypersexual, unethical, uncivil, and animalistic. According to Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, the rhetorical utility of respectability was that it functioned as a, quote, bridge discourse that mediated race relations by aligning Black women's behavior with dominant societal values and expectations. While such performances led to levels of social mobility, they also created a double bind, as the dignity denied Black women was only conceded to those who performed for the white gaze. This point is key. Consider Oprah's rendition of Alice Walker's The Color Purple. Specifically, the famous Hell No scene in which Sophia, a symbol of Black female independence and autonomy, is disciplined for publicly voicing her refusal to mammy and maid for the mayor's wife, Miss Millie. Would you like to be my maid, Miss Millie asked following a compliment about the cleanliness of Sophia's children. Sophia, hand-hipped and eyes glaring, gazed at Millie. Hell no. she said. The cognitive dissonance that causes that Millie experiences stupefies her. She replies confusedly, "What?" To which Sophia responds, "I said, hell no." When Millie's husband, the mayor, overhears Sophia, he steps in, slaps Sophia for being insolent, and is subsequently laid out by Sophia's vicious right hook. Sophia's fierce defense of her children, person, body, space, and time is violently reprimanded. She is brutalized by a white mob in front of her children, arrested and imprisoned for 12 years, and upon release, forced to do exactly what she said she would not, which is made for the mayor's wife, Miss Millie. Sophia's hell no is a righteous moment of self-possession that affirms her futural orientation. However, regardless of her fierce defense, Sophia is forced to bend to the hegemony of white time. Although a fictionalized scene, Black feminist historians such as Callie Nicole Gross, Cheryl Hicks, and Bria Willingham, among others, demonstrate that the civilizing strategies targeting Sophia are no different from those that mark and suspend everyday Black women within a time of endless subjugation and gendered anti-Black violence. Sophia's existence as the human subject murdered over and over again by the passions of a bloodless and anonymous anachronism, manifests as the daily indignity of living a present and anticipating a future of acquiescence to white supremacy. Captured by the very system and past that reads her as property to be reclaimed as opposed to the agental human being that she is. Sophia's refusal to mammy, i.e., to deplete time from her family and her children, alongside her fierce defense of that refusal, implies a countertemporality that manifests her rejection to captivity. I believe that it is this same countertemporality resonant in Sandra Bland's response to Insenia that marks her as a woman out of time. Scholarship examining gendered anti-Black policing has been instrumental in unpacking how the expectation to insulate white dominance through prescribed performances of Black deference and acquiescence, i.e. forms of civility, not only eclipses Black women's agency, but forestalls their mobility by suspending them within a mutilating temporality of gendered anti-Black violence. Andrea Ritchie's work on Black women, policing and violence, and Invisible No More, police violence against Black women and women of color, has been particularly useful. According to Ritchie, America's legacy of gendered anti-Black violence originating during slavery remains due to civil society's racialized expectation that Black women at all times embody the mammy. From slavery to Reconstruction to Jim Crow, civil society's veneration of mammy stemmed from the ways her submissiveness, maternal labor, domesticity, and piety sustained a white racial order. Unlike her emasculating, unwomanly, aggressive post-bellum antithesis, Sapphire, mammy was loyal to the operations of white supremacy, idealistically speaking. Under this racialized scheme of Black women who questioned, transgressed, and rejected the expectation to mammy were deemed unruly, uncivil, essentially bad women and bad citizens on account that their behavior neither revered nor served the mechanics of whiteness. According to historian Talitha Laforia, following emancipation, Black codes prohibiting domestics from leaving employers' property and those that required women over 18 to be gainfully employed criminalized the withdrawal of Black women's labor from the white private sphere. Those found violating what we might call mammy codes were arrested and returned to their employers like fugitive slaves, or jailed and leased out to work off their fines. Historian Sarah Haley's work at the intersections of race, gender, and incarceration further highlights the ways Black women's agency, particularly in public, has been criminalized. According to Haley, the disproportionate number of Black women charged with public quarreling, profane language, and unruliness following emancipation were members of the workforce criminalized for the ways their public presence and antithetical performances assaulted the racialized expectation that all Black women embody the ideal, submissive, demure subjectivity of mammy. Together, Ritchie, LaFloria, and Haley's work on gendered anti-Black policing demonstrates how the racialized ideal of Black womanhood not only informs social perceptions of Black women, but also, quote, police perceptions of what conduct is appropriate and permissible towards Black women, end quote. This perception of appropriate and permissible treatment towards Black women is grounded in an ideology of whiteness that understands Black women as antithetical to the defenses and protections afforded white women. Historically, police have perceived Black women and non-Black women of color as, quote, subhuman, animalistic, and as subjects worthy of violation, fear, and in need of swift and forceful submission and punishment. This perception commonly accompanies instances in which Black women's agency threatens the racial order of things. Such moments routinely solicit an overly aggressive response from law enforcement due to a struggle over legitimacy and authority. Scholarship examining interpersonal strategies exercised during police-citizen encounters note that instances of escalation are routinely the result of officers' struggle to establish authority. Legitimacy and authority are dialogically negotiated through a back and forth process of question and answer in which officers assume an institutional right to direct discourse, along with the expectation that citizens adhere to the expectation to follow and answer. Any deviation from this expectation is determined a failure to follow the law, right, and a threat. As a story of a non-mamming Black woman, Sophia's response implies a rejection of white temporal rhetorics that reinscribe the mammy as the ideal performance of Black womanhood. Recognizing this temporalization offers insight into how Black women struggle to reclaim their time in the face of logics that suffocate their capacity for a future beyond a stereotyped Black past. White temporal rhetorics reflect a hierarchy of values that reinscribe civility as deference to logics of a white racial order. Thus, the civility is a racist articulation of a past that expresses a desire for a particular kind of ordered present and future. Then we might read appeals to civility and civilizing strategies as not only modes of racial discipline, but also as the expression of a racialized temporality that manifests in the violent arrest of bodily will that is capture. As this scholarship demonstrates, civilizing strategies for Black women have historically been violent, as civilizing has always assumed the need to return Black women to some place or time of order, to send us back to a time when custom was indeed law. This return signals one aspect of civility's temporality, as here returning Black women to a time of order consigns us to a time in which we have no rights, a time in which we are not citizens, a time in which law and prevailing logic held that we were neither women nor human. Quote, as a materialized scene of unprotected flesh, Bland Stop offers an instance in which we might observe how the temporal racialization of civilizing strategies may be resisted. Part 3. I'm waiting on you. The dialogic of the stop and temporal reclamation. Oops. Scholarship on the gaze and surveillance from Black Cooks to George Yancey reminds that the right to look, let alone look, judge, and act, has been historically a marker of gendered and racialized power. In Black Looks, Bell Hooks examines the gaze as a powerful disciplinary technology that sustains a racist, heteropatriarchal society. Quote, there is power in looking, end quote, Hooks reminds, and what she defines as the oppositional gaze, that mode of resistance informed by, quote, a rebellious desire, end quote, to look with judgment, is a site of agency grounded in Black women's disidentification with the objectifying and dehumanizing gaze of white hegemony. Black Looks, writes Hooks, quote, were interrogating gazes, end quote, that defiantly declared, not only will I stare, but that I want my look to change reality, end quote. Returning to the stop, we see how Bland's oppositional gaze is voiced through her ability to dialogically assume authority during the encounter. After the initial stop, Insignia returns to issue a ticket. However, rather than addressing Bland once he's returned, Insignia instead stands in silence, actively glaring at Bland through the window, paternalistically waiting to be acknowledged. This moment registers as an audible pause in the video long enough to generate questions of intent. This moment long enough for us as the audience to see how Bland returns the indignity of being stopped by Insignia. If this is an effort to discipline behavior, then it fails because Bland, unfazed, remains silent, steadily looking forward towards the roadway as she awaits to be addressed. Consequently, the burden of breaking the silence falls to Ersula on account of Sandra's own strategic practice of what Glenn calls active non-engagement. Ersula is annoyed. The inflection in his voice signals a rising discontent. Are you okay? To which Sandra Bland replies, I'm waiting on you. This is your job. I'm waiting on you. When are you gonna let me go? Sandra's I'm waiting on you is significant, inverting the white inclination to temporal closure by insinuating that the one stuck, that the one who can't get over the past, that the one who's behind the times and needs to catch up is Ersula. I'm waiting on you marks blue time as behind. Sandra's response reflects what Tamika Carey theorizes as rhetorical impatience, which denotes instances in which the disciplinary power of Black women's self-care disturbs the hegemony of white time. It is an act of temporal reclamation, of, quote, reclaiming time, in the words of Maxine Waters, that exposes the ways white orientations of time perpetuate the racial deprivation of time via, quote, tacit forms of Black women's disrespect, unquote. Carey theorizes rhetorical impatience as dismissal, that is, which deciphers delays and trivials and keeps it moving, as confrontation that serves a pedagogical practice of deceleration, as indignant agency, which is basically not giving a fuck and doing it anyway, like suffering the consequences, right? Taking all of that on. As redress, redirecting disrespect. And also as repossession, reclamation of time. As she explains, these performances of frustration, quote, foreground the assumption that equity and justice for oneself, Black women and Black communities is already long overdue and thus requires speed and decisive action, end quote. Carey's interrogation of white time in Kairos is helpful for the ways it draws attention to the social norms informing impatience and determining who has the right to not only be impatient, but also who has the right to peek over the expiration of time. Such norms are governed by race and gendered hierarchies that normalize white temporal rhetorics that in assuming ownership over time, trivialize, waste, or transfer time in ways that sustain injustices. A sense of entitlement to other people's time, as Charles Mills makes clear, is characteristic of a white temporal orientation, and Ersula's performative insistence that Bland yield her time to him demonstrates an adherence to this orientation and the presumption of access to and ownership of other people's time. If reclaiming my time is an act of temporal reclamation, that I'm waiting on you is an act of rhetorical impatience that challenges the mechanization of blue time's white authority to close off Black futures. In closing out, in Red, White, and Black, Frank Wilderson observes how those who speak back to structural forces and demand an account of harms are further disempowered through rhetoric that marks ethical speech, like, I'm waiting on you. When are you going to let me go? Why do I have to put out my cigarette while I'm in my car? As crazy speech. What are we to make, asks Wilderson, quote, of a world that responds to the most lucid enunciation of ethics with violence, unquote. During the stop, Sandra asks several questions. The most pressing is, why do I have to put out my cigarette while I'm in my car? I'm sorry, the most pressing being, why do I have to put out my cigarette while in my car? As well as, I'm waiting on you. This question above all others voices Band's contempt for Ersula's intrusion, and two, wrestled authority away from Ersula by interrogating the legitimacy of the stop. Bland's interrogation of Ersula's assumed right to stop and impede her forward movement corresponds with the state's assumed right to interrupt and to demand her time. And Bland was intimately aware of the ways the state used pretext stops to not only immobilize her, but to impede her time and future progression. Bland's late life was comprised of repeated state intrusion, interruption, and seizure. From 2009 to 2014, Bland experienced stints of unemployment and a series of low-wage jobs unrelated to her degree as a result of the 2009 recession. Her efforts to find work were further complicated by the city's need for revenue. As reports from the Justice Department revealed of cities like Ferguson and Baltimore, Houston implemented a system of racialized taxing to finance a variety of city and state operations. Quote, in Harris County, which includes Houston, proportionately 3 times as many Blacks as whites were being arrested and subjected to harsh punishments in the county, end quote. Bland's first year in search of work was plagued by these constraints. In 2009, Bland received tickets for failure to wear a seatbelt, driving without liability insurance, and speeding, and was fined a total of $876.50. That same year, she was charged for possession of a small amount of marijuana. Her lawyer was able to get the charge and penalty lessened from prison time and a $4,000 fine to $500 and no jail time. In 2010, an unemployed and deeply in debt Bland was fined another $260 for speeding and a minor collision. During sentencing, Bland asked for leniency, explaining that she was unable to pay the fine because she was unemployed, but her statement had no effect and a warrant for her arrest was eventually issued for defaulting on payment. Further complicating 2010 was another traffic violation and possession charge, again for a small amount of marijuana. The second possession resulted in a third 3-day jail sentence, which Sandy then followed with several additional days of sitting out her time of the $260 traffic fine earlier that year. These extra days in jail helped Bland work off her fine by earning money through time spent via credit served. Earn credit for time served. The deluge of tickets, fines, and court costs, as well as an intermittent work continued after Sandy moved back home to Chicago. By 2014, she'd owed thousands of dollars in fines and court fees, but hope seemed to be on the horizon. She had landed an interview at her alma mater, and the prospects of employment and a means of self-sufficiency were within reach, or so she thought. 2015 was equally stressful, but on July 10th, 2015, Sandy was returning home happy and relieved. She had just secured a position as an outreach coordinator at her alma mater, Prairie View A&M near Houston, Texas. It was a serious win for Sandy. This is all to say that the 2010-2015 stop was not a temporary inconvenience for Sandra Bland, as it may have been for many of us, but rather as an accumulation of occurrences of capture and detention that ultimately resulted in her death. By challenging Yesenya's institutional right to interrupt and make demands on her time, Bland challenges the societal expectation that Black women display any public face other than the one historically assumed for them. As LaForia and Haley remind, the expectation to Mammy was normalized because custom and law made it so that Mammy was the only public face society permitted Black women to assume. Bland's refusal to deplete her time manifests as a countertemporal orientation to racism that challenges the normalized expectation to Mammy. This expectation informs state discourse justifying Yesenya's actions and use of lethal force during the stop. Former prosecutor Gabriel Chin told NBC News under Pennsylvania v. Mims, Yesenya was permitted to use force on account that his request that Bland exit the car, quote, obligated her to get out of the car when she was ordered to do so, end quote. According to Chin, Bland's arrest was justified because it resulted from her failure to heed a legislative expectation to follow the law. In a statement to the public, Texas District Attorney Alton Mathis further fueled the image of a contentious and uncivil Bland when he claimed that while it was far too early to know how Bland had died in her cell, it was not too early to know why she was in jail. According to Mathis, the video revealed a very combative Sandy who was less than a model person during her interaction with police. Retired NYPD Detective Harry Hawk was perhaps the most vocal critic. In a segment titled, Who's to Blame for Sandra Bland's Death, Hawk, while walking viewers through an analysis of the stop, concluded, quote, the whole thing here is that she, Bland, was very arrogant from the beginning, very dismissive of the officer. She was very uncooperative, end quote. According to Hawk, Bland's assault at the hands of the state trooper was a consequence of her own insolence and incivility. Has Sandy not been uncivil? If she had just adhered to the normalized expectations of her, then she would still be alive. In the case of Sandra Bland, misrepresentations of her as very combative, dismissive, uncooperative, arrogant, and as less than a model citizen, further fueled the image of a contentious and uncivil Black woman whose death, unofficials argued, was a consequence of her own insolence. Here we see how officials conflated Bland's healthy critique of the state with a disregard for the law. According to historian William Schaaf, appeals to civility customarily can channel dissent, quote, not through forbidding the articulation of radical ideas, but through controlling the discursive framework in which they can be considered and discussed, end quote. As Bland's case illustrates, charges of incivility grant officers in the state maximum power and minimum responsibility, as the power to define appropriate behavior is solely theirs. What Bland suffered was a, quote, retaliation of free expression, end quote, which the Ferguson report identified as part of a pattern of racial profiling and unwarranted stops targeting Blacks. Her death offers an example of how discourse policing the ways Black women show up in public produces murderous effects. Thank you.
All right. Dr. Orr, thank you so much for that presentation. I'll let you catch your breath there for a moment while I remind everyone that if you have a question, please place it in the Zoom Q&A. I will try to get to as many of them as I can in the next 15 minutes or so here that we have together. You know, one thing I was thinking about as you were talking is, you know, we've started to see in some small ways the, you know, perhaps efforts to, you know, rethink policing in cities, in communities, and in these types of things. And I'm just wondering if you have seen any evidence that this broader question of the rhetoric and the power dynamics and these things that you were describing, that is changing along with the policies and, you know, the budgets and all of these sorts of things.
So in all transparency, I have attended to questions around police reform. I haven't delved into it because, long story short, it's a weighted topic. It's a very weighted topic. And there's a level of self-care that I've been working to establish as a result of the work that I just got finished doing with the first book. You know, talking about forms of racialized death is not easy. And knowing that you are a part of that history and then being snatched up by the very history that people are telling you that doesn't exist. And then working through that is another form of, not another form of living, it's just life, long story short. So as I've been working to live my life and live my life in healthy ways, I've been working to limit myself from the deluge of hourly images of Black death, hourly, daily stories of Black death, the repeated image of what looks like myself, my siblings, my family members, my friends, my extended kin, of forms of racialized violence writ large. And so to answer that question, well, what I want to say is that I felt ill-equipped to answer that question effectively. What I can say is what I've attended to with regard to the language is the complete dismissal, right, of the way that an individual's efforts to live is literally criminalized, right? And the capacity to articulate that is identified as a form of resistance. And the simple use of the term of the language of resistance, when someone is literally trying to speak, trying to breathe, and that is legislated, legally codified as resistance, right? That is then, you know, that can justify, you know, lethal force. What I want to do with my work, what I worked to do with the first project was simply invite and simply work to produce a way of reading. And I don't want to say produce a way of reading, but remind the public that there are various lenses for understanding how citizenship manifests in contemporary forms. And they recognize the connection between the past, present, and the concern for the future, and the repetition of what we see as our current present, right? Which seems to be very much associated with the past, because It's not dead and gone. It is very much here. And until we actually attend to it, address it, develop measures of accountability, right, that hold people accountable. And when I say people, I'm thinking much largely of systems. People make up systems, right? Until that happens, these measures of accountability are pretty put in place. I'm a little more pessimistic than I should be. And I'm working to find ways to have a little more hope. That's a long way of saying I cannot directly, explicitly answer that question. But I'm slowly working to it because, as I said, this is a much larger project, and these are very much questions that I have to attend to. I'm just not incredibly hopeful. I'm not hopeful for what the push for police reform will do. I feel like it was more so there was energy behind it, and now that energy's been allowed to, lay at the waysides. And so I'm not very hopeful that there will be, I'm more concerned that what will be required is another deluge of Black death or other forms of racialized violence to ignite yet more energy for public change, for systematic public change. And that's what hurts my heart. And that's what I really don't want to attend to, because when you ask the question, that's immediately the conclusion that I run to. And that's not where I should go. So I'm working for other avenues to be hopeful.
Right. No, and this is incredibly difficult work. And as the comments in the chat are pouring in, thank you to you for doing it and for sharing it with all of us. And I'm sure every time you give one of these talks, you're kind of having to process through all of these things again, and that is no small task in any measure. So thank you very much. You mentioned citizenship before, and there's a question here about how you think about the intersection between citizenship and time, particularly how would you see time working in the constitution of citizenship, particularly in the ways that nation states have and continue to render them on racialized bodies?
Jesus. I don't know. Wow. I mean, where is that question?
It's in the Q&A.
Is this Cameron? I just see a very long.
No, it's Ismail's in the Zoom Q&A, not in the chat. We can come back to it. There are several others here.
I haven't sat with that and given that thought. I haven't thought explicitly about citizenship of time. I've thought about it as racialized time through racialized time and performance of citizenship. And I feel like your question is asking me to think about it differently, which is why I feel ill-equipped to respond. I'm thinking, all right, I need to delve. It's asking me a different question, and it's asking me to investigate what I've been doing slightly differently, which I very much appreciate. And I also want to know, do I get to keep these questions?
We can send them to you, certainly, yes.
Because otherwise, like if I was there, I get to sit with people, talk to people, I'd be taking down notes. Like I could do all of that, but these are fantastic questions, and I would like to be able to engage them because they only help me, sharpen my knife and sharpen my thinking. So yeah, thank you for the question, Ishmael.
Sure. Another question here about if you could speak to the qualities of speed and slowness in the cases that you are examining.
The quality of speed and slowness. Oh, that's a great one. I haven't very much thought about speed other than to recognize that there's a sense of finality from the beginning. The way I read these situations, that there's a sense of finality from the beginning, and this is the reason why we always already know what's going to happen and how it's going to end, right? So when I think about however long a trial may take, or however quick a trial may take, regardless, it doesn't matter how long or how short the process is, the end result is typically usually the same. And I guess I'm more thank you for this question, because I haven't really given it thought, but I guess as I'm talking this out, thinking this out loud with you, I guess I'm more interested in that kind of repetition and how it connects to these larger theories of what Saidiya Hartman and what Christina Sharp are identifying as, slavery's afterlife. I'm looking at it as that. And I guess this is partly because patterns, I always see, not always see, but I guess I'm attracted to certain patterns. And I don't know what that means, that I'm attracted to this kind of pattern, but it's partly that I can't get this. Every time I wake up, news, television, driving somewhere, there's always the same iteration of forms of mutilation, right? That are utilized to constitute subjectivity, humanity, citizenship, the nation. And so this onslaught is what I keep noticing, and just tracking that and the ways that it manifests throughout time in certain ways. I think that is what this project in part might be doing. I think another part of what this project might be working to investigate is just that, that 24-hour period of Bland's interaction with law enforcement on July 10th to July 11th. And sitting with that in a chapter fashion to dig through each of those instances, from the moment of how the larger public has identified her as crazy and as insane, and what it means to be self-possessed, a Black woman self-possessed in America. From this notion of time and temporality, as you're saying, I think about it as her working to evade forms of captivity and capture, but yet still getting snatched back, but having the gall and the audacity to say, I will still push forward, and recognizing that as part of a larger tradition, one that we've seen manifest in expressive culture, and the one that we study as communication scholars, rhetoricians, and writing study scholars, and the writing and the speech of numerous intellectuals and leaders, and everyday people and everyday citizens as well. But I'm recognizing in this moment of police-citizen interaction, partly because the assumed framework and narrative that we have is one of law and order, right and wrong, very much Black and white. When we already know that there's a gray level, a gray area, and I'm just simply asking us to just, when we see these types of instances, these types of moments, because they're going to continually repeat, this is another way that we can read them, right? And working to encourage a different mode of reading citizenship engagement, right? Rather than reading it as insolence, which is connecting it to a racialized, stereotyped Black past, because you can't recognize this body as anything other than that, right? You can't recognize this as human. You can't recognize this as real. You can't recognize this as self-possessed and self-owned, right? And so I guess I'm more interested in the ways that we read and forms of interpretation than anything else. And that's why I keep sitting with this moment of dialogue, because the assumption is that deliberation is what constitutes a democracy, right? But if you can't deliberate in the moment of trying to save your life, right, because you're already assumed to not be human, then it's not about whether or not I can get, it's not about whether or not I can get you to hear me. It's about how I choose to spend my time within the time that I have, right? And that's also a very pessimistic view, which, it touches back to a larger theoretical framework as well, right? But it's through the acknowledgement of capture and captivity, right? But also in some aspects of this audacity to push against it. It's those moments in time, those iterations, that play that I think I'm being drawn to more than anything else.
Right, and another way to think about time, one of the questions brought up the notion of straight time and kind of normative temporality for marriage, reproduction, et cetera, that are also decidedly white. I'm wondering if, or this person with the question was wondering if you have thoughts on the connections or perhaps disjunctures between white time and straight time.
No, I hadn't thought about that. I actually had just started delving into conversations specifically about queer time, And it's the way reading straight time through queer time, basically, and having an understanding of how straight time and white time kind of link with what I'm trying to identify as blue time. That's where I've been so far. But this notion of normalizing temporality, which is part of a larger hegemonic, framework, I very much appreciate this notion of marriage time. Yeah.
So can you say more about blue time and where maybe you see some of that work going?
I'm thinking more so about like the interdiction, like process of interdiction. And I'm thinking about the language and the dialogue that officers typically deploy in moments of interaction with citizens. And how it is kind of routined. There's this notion of order and this expectation of delivery and an immediate, at any time where there's a question or a confusion, there isn't a concern or care, it is an immediate form of discipline or punishment for not having responded in the fashion expected or desired. It's sort of kind of like this kind of gotcha game that you end up playing in the moment where you're being questioned, or interacting with an officer. And this is me looking at instances of Black women, right? Being engaged by officers during moments of stop, whether that stop occur as a traffic stop, grocery store, as she's knocking on the door, various houses because she is a state representative, campaigning, right, in public, but but somebody called the police on her saying there's this random woman walking around prowling in our neighborhood. These kind of interactions to see what happens, how officers speak to Black women and how Black women work to respond. And with regard to this notion of time, the time between, and this is also thinking about why I really appreciate Tamika Carey's work with Rhetorical Impatience, because she's identifying that there is a time where you can no longer participate, and I'm just going to be frank here, in the bullshit, right? And where you have to literally what I've theorized earlier back in 2017, which is you have to push back, particularly in these moments of racial stratification, where in the piece that I wrote with regard to pushback, I was thinking very much about the university space as a white habitus, right? And the deluge of violences and harms that come with that, and self-protective measure of redistributing those harms or redirecting the burden of whiteness back upon its issuant, right? This is literally what Sandy is doing in the moment of the stop. This is literally what I've been seeing Black women and women of color do in the middle of the stop, and recognizing the way that discourses of civility are used to criminalize those performances in very different ways, right? Where there seems to be a stratification between who can be saved, or who the state is desirous of saving, right? And who the state doesn't mind just completely disposing. Yeah, so with regard to blue time, I've been working at just trying to think about some of the very specific language that officers use that designate that the citizen's time is almost up before some violent act happens. I really feel like there's a countdown. For instance, going back to Sandra Bland, the dialogic of the stop, when a senior approaches the car, he stands there and waits, right? And we all, I shouldn't say this, but if you watch the video long enough, right, and if you're familiar enough with certain forms of social interaction and engagement, you're wondering, why is he pausing? You would think that he would say, okay, here's your ticket. This is what you were in violation of, but he doesn't do that, right? And for those of us who've never really been stopped by an officer, we might not know what the protocol is, right? But there's so many protocols that he breaks, so many habits and practices that he breaks, and every moment that he deviates, right, is the moment of time taken, right? Which she struggles and takes back by choosing not to look at him during the interaction, saying, you will have to address me. You are on my time. I am forward moving, right? I've continually had these interruptions by bodies in blue who operate with this white power and the power of the state to suspend me in the same way historically Black women have always been suspended, but I refuse not. I had the audacity to say that I would put one foot forward. So I'm just waiting on you. I'm waiting on you to get yourself together, compared to him standing there, and he doesn't voice this, but he is saying, I'm waiting on you, Sandy, to get yourself together, to come into compliance with my expectations, and then I will verbally address you. In order to do that, you must give me eye contact. You must open up that moment of intimacy to me by giving me eye contact, which she denies. And again, like I said, this is a very brief version. There were a lot of things that were cut out for time, and I'm taking up way too much time as it is. But thank you so much for these questions. Thank you so much.
And I have them all captured. I will send them to you. There are so many good questions that we did not even get to. We could be here all afternoon and well into the evening, I think. But I think I will turn it back over to Xiao Ye. And thank you again, Dr. Orr, very much appreciated.
Thank you all so much.
Yes, Dr. Orr, thank you so much for this thought-provoking talk. Your talk really gave us another opportunity to reflect upon topics such as, you discussed about police reform, self-care, and ways to reimagine community care and so on. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you take the time, to really get up early for the talk, because it's a 3-hour difference. We discussed the difference, across the 2 locations. And also let me thank Jenna for mediating the Q&A. You did a fantastic job. Thank you so much. So now, without further ado, let's move into the presentation of Student Essay Awards. The annual Kenneth Burke Prize in Rhetoric is awarded to recognize written work by a graduate student in one of Penn State's liberal arts disciplines on the subject of rhetoric in its many forms, such as historical, critical, or theoretical discourse. So here I would like to invite Dr. Brett Vivian to announce the winner. This year, first Dr. Vivian and Dr. Jack Selzer serve as the judges.
All right, thank you, Xiao Ye. Let me just join in this absolute party in the chat, thanking Dr. Orr for her wonderful presentation. And I really appreciate the opportunity to present this work on this occasion. I'll just be assuming my video and audio is working okay, but Jenna, somebody let me know if not. Thank you for the thumbs up. So thanks to Dr. Seltzer for working with me this year to evaluate all these wonderful submissions. Thank you for everybody who entered the competition. Always just wonderful and excellent, and even inspiring, genuinely, to see the work that our graduate students in rhetoric are doing throughout the College of Liberal Arts. Before I announce this year's recipient of the Burke Prize, we like to give honorable mention to 2 papers that we thought were just excellent. We, deliberated for a long time over the top 3. So in no particular order, Alison Niebauer, her paper was titled Assigning Guilt and Dispersing Blame, Conspiracy Discourse and the Limits of Law in the Nuremberg Trials. Her analysis of the Nuremberg Trials explores the use of everyday conspiratorial discourse, both in terms of historical narrativization and its efficacy in law. And there's all sorts of wonderful insights she develops about the use of conspiracy in legal trials, the shaping of historical narration of events, issues of responsibility and guilt too. And then our second honorable mention goes to Jeff Nagel, whose paper was titled Invisibility in the Daughters of Bilitis, From Tactical Activism to Radical Separatism. Nagel examines the importance of visibility to the formation and advocacy of the Daughters of Bilitis, a lesbian activist organization established in the mid-1950s. And his analysis of the group engaged important dimensions of pre-Stonewall queer history and rhetoric. Both papers, we thought, should be highly commended publicly for their scholarly sophistication, their engagement with all kinds of disciplinary and interdisciplinary literature, and the impressiveness of their insights. Without further ado, however, we'd like to congratulate the official recipient of this year's Burke Prize in Rhetoric, Kelly Williams Nagel. The title of her paper is Unraveling Lost Cause Historiography, Places for Encounter at the Robert E. Lee Statue in Richmond, Virginia. Nagel conducts a spatial microhistory in this paper to analyze several key events that occurred at the Lee statue in Richmond between May and August 2020. And she examines how protesters used the space throughout that summer to contest racist historiographies and transform the space into one of racial equality. Conducting such a spatial micro-history of the Lee statute, the author maintains, reveals new opportunities for protesting controversial memorial spaces. So we found the analytic focus of this paper highly impressive. It reconciles theory, historical literature, and critical work on memorial spaces into an analysis of a timely, contested, and deeply painful memorial site. So timely and impressive all around. Congratulations to Kelly Williams-Nagel, and thank you again to everybody who participated.
Thank you very much. Next, let me invite Dr. Jack Seltzer to announce the winner for the Rhetoric of the Civil Rights Movement undergraduate essay contest. And Dr. Seltzer was the originator as well as the organizer of the undergraduate essay contest. So let me take the opportunity to thank you, Jack. Thank you so much for helping me out. Jack, you need to unmute yourself. Yes.
Well, it's great to be unmuted by popular demand, Xiaoye. Thank you for this wonderful occasion, and thanks to Ersula Orr for that amazing talk. So much food for thought there, and we're going to find ways to get you back here, Dr. Orr, in person one day soon. As Xiaoye mentioned, this year the CDD and the McCourtney Institute sponsored an essay contest in tandem with its contributions to the Voices of Democracy and Rhetoric of the Civil Rights Movement websites. Those two websites call attention to and offer pedagogical support for discursive events associated with the African-American freedom struggle. The contest invited Penn State undergraduates to enter their rhetorical analyses for consideration. The winning essay was written by Luke Scanlon. Luke's entry was suggested to him by the instructor of his Rhetoric and Civic Life course, Michael Young. Luke examined Martin Luther King Jr.'s presentation entitled America's Chief Moral Dilemma, which was delivered in Atlanta on May 10th, 1967. Luke Scanlon took into account the rhetorical challenges faced by Dr. King as he addressed his complex and interracial audience on that day. And then Mr. Scanlon showed how Dr. King achieved his rhetorical goals and met his rhetorical challenges by controlling tone, employing repetitions, and organizing for maximum effect, among other things. So congratulations, Luke Scanlon. Enjoy your $1,000 prize, and we look forward to seeing your work on the Rhetoric of the Civil Rights webpage. Luke, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm honored to accept this award and to be a part of this tradition as part of Penn State. And I think it's always very important to reflect on the movements and rhetoric of the past to gain a better perspective on where we're at now and set a path moving forward. And I'd also just like to join in with everyone else in thanking Dr. Orr for your great lecture. It'll definitely be a lot to reflect on in the future. Thank you.
Jack, thank you very much. Callie, I wonder whether you would like to say a few words of gratitude if you have some words already in mind.
Sure. Hi, thank you so much for this award, and thank you to Ersula for your wonderful lecture. I wanted to thank the CDD and the reviewers for your welcome feedback, and thank Dr. Cheryl Glenn, who helped me with this paper. I wrote it in her class last semester. My husband, Jeff Nagel, Michelle Kennerly, my advisor, and my cohort, who we make a great team, and I'm very grateful for their support. So thank you. All
right, thank you very much, and congratulations to Callie and Luke. Following this presentation, you will receive an award plaque, which can be mailed at your request, and an award check in recognition of your achievements. The Center for Democratic Deliberation is proud to celebrate your contributions in improving democratic deliberation on campus and in the community beyond it. Really, thank you very much. And finally, just a few concluding remarks. I would like to take the opportunity to acknowledge a few groups and individuals in particular. We're very proud to annually support the faculty and students in rhetoric and the civic life who organize Deliberation Nation every year. The student leaders in State of State and the organizers of Camp Rhetoric. So does that sound familiar? Camp Rhetoric, we are still holding it every year from the graduate programs in CAS and English. All of them showcase remarkable undergraduate and graduate student contributions to the democratic, to the deliberative and academic culture of Penn State. I congratulate them with genuine admiration for their efforts and achievements. The same is true for the award-winning scholars on the CDD advisory board and also among the rhetoric graduate students in CAS and English. Congratulations for what you have published, the student lives you have impacted, and the honors you have earned, and the professional challenges that you are meeting. And also, I want to take the opportunity to thank the McConnell Institute for Democracy, Michael Berkman, Chris Bean, and Jenna Spinell for supporting the work of the CDD. And of course, it's an opportunity to thank the CDD Advisory Board members, including Suresh Kalagaraja, Jeremy Engels, Ebony Clatters, Debbie Hawhey, Jack Selzer, Katrina Haskins, and also my graduate assistant, Ishmael Valdivia. And you advised me on a multitude of matters, including, for example, selecting Dr. Ersula J as this year's book lecturer. Thank you so much for helping me out this past year. And finally, let me end by sharing a piece of good news, I think. That is Penn State will host the 2023 ISA Summer Institute. So in 2 years. So our work in democratic deliberation will continue, and let's get back to work. Thank you very much. Thank you.